The United States Marines were in deep trouble. October 25th, 1942, was a miserable day for them on the island of Guadalcanal, with gunfire all along their perimeter. The Marines called it Dugout Sunday. Heavy rain on the previous day had halted all air operations. However, the Japanese were attacking them in full force. In the morning, Japanese planes bombed Henderson Field, the Marine airstrip, while land and sea traffic picked up on all sides of the island. Every American on Guadalcanal knew that this was Japan's big push to retake the Solomon Islands. It was do or die. Would they make it out alive? Back in August 1942, the 1st Marine Division had landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomons as part of Operation Watchtower, the first major U.S. offensive in the Pacific theater of World War II. But within 2 days of the landing, disaster struck. Japanese naval forces from Rabaul counterattacked, defeating Allied forces at the Battle of Santa Cruz Island. Having lost 4 cruisers and over 1,000 men killed, the Allied fleet retreated into open water, leaving the Marines trapped. Meanwhile, Japanese reinforcements poured in, hoping to retake Guadalcanal. A new regiment arrived in August, then a new brigade landed in September. Finally, a fresh division came ashore in October, and yet the Marines held on. But as of the 3rd week of October, Major General Alexander Vandegrift believed his Marines could not last much longer without the Navy's help. The fleet needed to return to the Solomon Islands, it needed to secure the area, and it needed to sink the Japanese carrier fleet. The success of the American war effort in the South Pacific hinged on the results of the next battle at sea. That battle came on October 26, 1942, one day after Dugout Sunday. It was called the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. To the sailors who participated in it, it was simply Bloody Santa Cruz. Although the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands is largely forgotten today, it was one of the epic clashes of the Pacific War, involving 2 aircraft carrier fleets that engaged each other from afar. Although it is not as famous as the Battle of Midway or the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Santa Cruz was as important to America's overall success in World War II. It determined if the U.S. Navy would reclaim the South Pacific. Although scholars have sometimes described it as a tactical defeat for the United States Navy, its long-term consequences produced a strategic victory, as it drove the Japanese carrier force back into hiding and enabled the Allied conquest of Guadalcanal, the only major American offensive in the Pacific in the year 1942. More importantly, 262 American sailors gave their lives during this battle, a testament to the engagement's ferocity. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands occurred because of plans made by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. From his base at Truk Atoll, Yamamoto arranged for an all-out offensive to settle the stalemated Solomon Islands campaign once and for all. On land, Lieutenant General Hirokichi Hayakutake would launch an assault against the U.S. Marines. At sea, 3 Japanese fleets under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, and Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe would sail from Truk toward the Santa Cruz Islands, a small island cluster south and east of the Solomons. This move would threaten America's South Pacific base at Espiritu Santo and draw out the U.S. fleet so it could be engaged in a climactic, decisive battle. Between them, the 3 Japanese fleets contained 3 fleet carriers, the Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Junyo, 1 light carrier, the Zuiho, 5 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 44 destroyers. On October 18th, when news of the Japanese offensive reached his headquarters in Hawaii, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy's Pacific Forces, replaced his deputy commander in the South Pacific. Unable to respond to the Japanese threat, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley was wasting away in the tropical climate on Noumea, struggling with health problems and depression. Nimitz believed the time had come for an aggressive commander to take charge. Gormley's replacement, Vice Admiral William Halsey, acted quickly. Although it was hardly ideal, he decided to take Yamamoto's bait by sending his ships to the Santa Cruz Islands. He had little choice. General Hyakutaki's offensive had already begun. The Solomon Islands needed to be secured, and the Marines required the Navy's assistance to do it. As Halsey remembered, "I had to begin throwing punches almost immediately. Quick decisions had to be made." During a brief conference with General Vandegrift, Halsey promised to give him everything he had available. Unfortunately, the U.S. Navy's South Pacific Force was in miserable shape. Over the course of the past 5 months, the U.S. fleet had lost heavily in aircraft, pilots, and aircraft carriers. On May 8th, USS Lexington was sunk by Japanese carrier bombers at the Battle of the Coral Sea. 1 month later, a Japanese submarine sank USS Yorktown as it was returning from the Battle of Midway. On August 31st, another Japanese submarine torpedoed USS Saratoga, sending it to Pearl Harbor for 3 months' worth of repairs. Finally, on September 15th, another Japanese submarine torpedoed USS Wasp, sending it to the bottom of the Pacific, along with 45 planes and 193 men. Only 2 aircraft carriers remained, USS Hornet and USS Enterprise. Together with 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, and 13 destroyers, Hornet and Enterprise formed Task Force 61, commanded by Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid. Halsey's orders to Kinkaid were to sweep north of the Santa Cruz Islands and search for enemy ships. If Kinkaid's carriers found nothing, they had orders to rendezvous with Rear Admiral Willis Lee's surface fleet near Rennell Island. However, Halsey anticipated that Kinkaid's carriers would make contact. Like Yamamoto, he predicted that the resulting battle would be decisive. Each day, one of the 2 American carriers sent out search planes looking for traces of the enemy fleet. But each day, they found nothing. For 5 days, the Japanese admirals kept their ships out of range of the Santa Cruz Islands, awaiting news of the surrender of the Marines on Guadalcanal. But then, on the morning of October 25th, an American land-based B-17 flying out of Guadalcanal and 2 PBY flying boats from Santa Cruz and Espiritu Santo located the 3 Japanese fleets. Once spotted, the Japanese admirals knew they must attack the next day. Using the nighttime hours to ready their airstrikes, they marked October 26th as the day to commence the sea battle that Yamamoto had envisioned. From his base at Noumea, Halsey learned of these sighting reports. The Japanese were in full force near Santa Cruz, and the Americans were badly outnumbered. Still, Halsey gave Kinkaid an order to engage. A message came in over the radio: "Strike! Repeat, strike!" With that, the Battle of Santa Cruz was on. In the following videos, you will hear the words of participants from that battle. Many of these veterans who fought there have since passed on, but before they died, they left behind vivid accounts of their experiences. Voice actors will read aloud their words to bring their experiences back to life. And thus, we can take a step forward and put Bloody Santa Cruz back into the pantheon of famous American naval engagements. Prior to dawn on October 26, 1942, the American task force in the South Pacific, called Task Force 61, steamed northwest, closing with its adversary, the Japanese carrier force called Kido Butai. The previous day at 9:45 a.m., an American PBY launched from the Santa Cruz Islands had spotted Kido Butai, which consisted of 3 carriers, 2 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. The pilot radioed his sighting report, which soon made its way to the bridge of USS Enterprise and into the hands of the American Task Force commander, Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid. This report put the Japanese carrier force at a distance of 375 miles, too far away for the Americans to launch an airstrike. At 2 p.m., Kinkaid launched a Hail Mary airstrike consisting of 20 aircraft. These planes searched all afternoon, but found no enemy ships. The pilots returned after dark, and 8 planes were lost when they crashed on the deck or ditched in the water. 2 aviators were killed. Kincaid realized that he could not hope to win the battle if he endangered his pilots with impossibly long-range missions. He concluded that he could not authorize an airstrike unless he had confirmation from a carrier-based scout plane. In the nighttime hours, his task force continued to close the distance to the enemy fleet, with many of the pilots sleeping in their ready rooms in case they needed to launch in a hurry. At 5:12 a.m., the duty carrier USS Enterprise turned into the wind and launched 16 SBD dive bombers to perform the morning search. The aircraft operated in pairs, with each team flying a 15-degree quadrant away from the carrier for a distance of 200 miles. For more than an hour, the SBD teams cruised through the dark morning sky at an altitude of 12,000 feet. Despite the blackness, visibility was good, with only a few scattered cumulus clouds covering about 40% of the horizon. The pilots and the rear seat gunners felt incredible tension. After several months of dogged combat, they understood the reality of carrier versus carrier warfare. The fleet that made the first accurate sighting report usually got in the first hit, and therefore it had the best chance to win the battle. Everything depended on these SBD crewmen finding their quarry before the enemy found their own fleet. One of the first teams to make contact was a two-plane group from Scouting Squadron 10. Lieutenant J.G. Howard Burnett and Lieutenant J.G. Kenneth Miller piloted these aircraft. Radioman 3rd Class David Colley occupied the rear cockpit of Miller's SBD. Only 18 years old at the time, Colley recalled the moment that the Japanese fleet came into view.
About 1.5 hours outbound, I noticed a very slight bump on the horizon nearly dead ahead. I notified Mr. Miller on the intercom and we agreed it had to be the topmast of some ship. I waved the other plane up and pointed. I estimated it was 30 miles or so. Eventually we climbed up and took a good look. Directly ahead of us, about 12 to 15 miles out, was a beautiful enemy fleet, 2 Congo-class battleships with big pagoda masts. They were accompanied by 4 cruisers and 6 to 8 destroyers, headed south at about 20 knots.
Specifically, Colley and Miller had found Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe's vanguard force, which consisted of the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, 4 cruisers and 7 destroyers. Immediately, Colley and Miller composed a contact report, which Colley sent by continuous wave over his plane's transmitter. After both SBDs had sent their messages, Lieutenant J.G. Burnett ordered an attack. The pilots armed their bombs and climbed to 9,000 feet. Both pilots expected to test their luck against one of the battleships, but as they passed over the heavy cruiser Tone, Japanese lookouts spotted the 2 planes. Unable to identify the aircraft, the signalmen winked their searchlights to see if either plane would give a recognition signal. When the Americans gave no satisfactory response, the crewmen on Tone turned their guns on them. Colley remembered what happened next.
The big cruiser started firing all its guns at us, followed in moments by several other ships. I was standing in the back cockpit, hanging onto my guns with one hand and leaning out, looking over the wing at the ships. I wondered where all those shells and AA projectiles were. Then the sky just exploded with every color. Gray, black, silver, blue, and long trails of smoky phosphorus. One went off under our right wing and we were blown over on our back. It was a terrible loud wham, like being inside a tin can that someone hit with a shotgun.
Miller and Burnett knew they couldn't proceed through the anti-aircraft fire for much longer. Quickly, both pilots decided to dive on Tone and leave the battleships alone. The dive bombers nosed downward, plunging through the multicolored AA fire and released their 500-pound bombs. Both bombs missed. As Miller's plane leveled out just above the waves, anti-aircraft fire continued to burst all around. Radioman Colley remembered the next few harrowing minutes.
The AA continued as we dove at a very high speed, clear down to 50 or 100 feet above the water, heading east. The battleships began shooting their main batteries at us. The big shells would hit the water very near us and send up big geysers. We would take evasive action, and still they came close to hitting us. This went on until we were over the horizon and a full 15 miles away, and only the tops of their pagodas were visible. We checked with each other and determined that we were both okay. We weren't sure about the plane, but it seemed to run and handle all right. We couldn't see Burnett's plane at all.
Burnett's and Miller's planes returned to USS Enterprise at 9:30, although both planes were full of holes. Burnett and Miller were not the only pilots who tested their luck in a dive-bombing attack. 3 quadrants to starboard, another team made a bigger discovery. At 8:05, Lieutenant Stockton Bernie Strong and his wingman, Ensign Charles Irvine, came into contact with Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike group, which consisted of 3 aircraft carriers. Strong signaled to Irvine that they must attack immediately. 2 months earlier, Strong had been involved in a nearly identical situation. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, he had found an enemy aircraft carrier but did not attack it, choosing instead to make sure he sent a perfect contact report. After he returned to his ship, having let the enemy carrier get away, Enterprise's flight operations officer, Commander John Crommelin, admonished him for not attacking. In fact, Crommelin was so angry at Strong that he put him in hack, that is, confined him to quarters, for a few days. Then, on the morning of the October 26th search mission, Crommelin saw the need to remind Strong and Irvine of their obligation to take risks. He said, "If you're going to miss with your bomb, you might as well stay home and let a good pilot take your place." Luckily, on October 26th, Bernie Strong found his chance at redemption. As Strong and Irvine armed their bombs, their gunners frantically tapped out a message to USS Enterprise, reporting the location of the Japanese carrier fleet. Then, from 14,000 feet, the 2 SBDs nosed over and dived toward the nearest Japanese carrier, which turned out to be the 11,000-ton light carrier Zuiho. The sailors on Zuiho didn't see the 2 American planes until the last second. Both bombs struck the aft flight deck, turning it into a pile of flame and shrapnel. Although Zuiho was not sunk, the bomb damage knocked it out of the battle. It did not return to the war until January 1943. Both Strong and Irvine managed to return to their carrier, but they almost didn't make it. Japanese fighters chased them for 45 miles, and Irvine's tail was chewed up. By the time they landed at 10:30, each plane was nearly out of gas. Commander Crommelin was so pleased with Strong's performance that he recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Several months later, he received the Navy Cross. Although largely forgotten in the greater history of the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the morning search missions were essential to the U.S. Navy's performance. To stand a chance at victory, Kinkaid's carrier planes needed to strike fast. The search plane reports from that morning, which also led to the damage on Zuiho, gave the American fleet a fighting chance. On the morning of October 26, 1942, the 2 fleets embroiled in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands rushed to get their airstrikes off their carrier decks. The 2 fleets had discovered each other at roughly the same time. Between 6:15 and 8 o'clock a.m., American scout planes reported multiple contacts with the Japanese fleet in the waters northwest of Santa Cruz. Meanwhile, at 6:17, a Japanese scout plane from the carrier Shokaku made contact with the American fleet, Task Force 61. However, the contact report did not reach the ranking Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, until 7 a.m. Both sides launched their airstrikes simultaneously. Nagumo's planes started getting airborne at 7:10, and on the American side, USS Hornet began launching about 20 minutes later. On the American flagship, USS Enterprise, Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid realized that time was of the essence. His strike groups needed to head off as soon as they were launched. There was no time for a multi-squadron rendezvous. At 7:50 a.m., Enterprise turned into the wind to launch its airstrike. The deck handlers held up a sign warning the pilots that they were on their own. It read, "Proceed without a Hornet." 20 planes got off the deck, 9 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, 3 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and 8 F-4F Wildcat fighters. Led by Commander Richard Gaines, Enterprise's attack group headed northwest, seeking out the last reported position of Kido Butai, then 20 minutes old, which placed the enemy fleet at 200 miles distance, traveling at a speed of 25 knots. Making haste, the torpedo bombers took up a cruising altitude of 9,000 feet. The fighters were 1,000 feet above them, and the dive bombers higher still. Enterprise's airstrike had proceeded about 60 miles when they were attacked by the Japanese airstrike, which was coming at them from exactly the opposite direction. Leading a pack of 9 A6M Type 0 fighters, Lieutenant Seneyasu Hidaka saw the American planes. Fearful of what they might accomplish if left unchecked, Hidaka decided to peel away from the main body of the Japanese airstrike and give the Americans a rude surprise. He signaled to his wingmen to attack. Swooping down from 14,000 feet, the Zeros homed in on the 9 TBF Avengers led by Lieutenant Commander John Collett. Lieutenant Hidaka aimed for Collett's plane, riddling it with machine gun fire. Gamely, the 2 gunners inside the plane, radioman Thomas Churchill Nelson and aviation machinist mate Stephen Naddison Jr., returned fire. But soon their torpedo bomber caught fire and they realized they needed to bail out. Radioman Nelson was only 22 years old. He was the tunnel gunner, the man who operated the radio in the belly of the plane. He was the only member of his crew to survive. Years later, he described how he got out.
Just about that time, the Zeros jumped us. They came down right out of the sun. The turret gunner was firing a 50 caliber right over my head. I could hear that. I levered the 30 caliber down, but I didn't see anybody. About that time, we got hit. Almost immediately, there was a lot of smoke and pieces flying past that I could see. I found out later that we got hit right up in the cockpit area. I grabbed the microphone and tried to call the pilot a couple times and never got an answer back. I pulled the pin on the door and it shattered. When I pulled the pin, it let the hinges go, so I kicked the door out, what was left of it, to make a hole to get out. I clipped on my emergency chute. It was a 36-foot diameter chute that we had. I clipped that onto my harness and got the gunner to come down out of the cockpit. He never wore his harness because it was cramped, so I handed it up to him. He indicated for me to get out of his way, so I bailed out. I didn't wait or count to 10 or yell Geronimo. I just pulled the ring right away. When I went out of the hatch, I hit the edge of the plane and it skinned me pretty bad right along the ankle. Whap! It blacked me out. When I came to, I heard a funny noise, and that damned Zero that got us was strafing me. The chute was all of a sudden filled with a lot of holes, so I started playing like I was dead. As a result, when I got down and hit the water, I went under, and when I came back up, I was all tangled up in the chute. The harness and chute and everything weighed quite a bit. I got it off okay, but one of those damn shrouds caught on my belt buckle, so I loosened that and got rid of that. About that time, I pulled on my Mae West. One side was good, but the other was a dud. I got it over my head anyway. There was shrapnel coming down around me. I ducked under the water. I watched, and 2 Zeros and some of our F4Fs were having a dogfight right over my head. I saw a couple of planes shot down right there. I had just barely made it. By the time I went out, I was only at 2,000 feet. I probably should have died.
Nelson's fellow crewmen did not survive. Naddison never left the airplane, apparently unable to put on his emergency chute in time. Lieutenant Commander Collett bailed out over the wing but was never seen again. 2 other American torpedo planes were shot down during the ambush, as were 3 American fighter planes. 2 other torpedo bombers aborted the mission and ditched into the ocean on the way back to their fleet. Only 4 torpedo planes managed to reach the Japanese fleet and drop torpedoes. All of them missed their targets. Floating in his half-filled Mae West, Radioman Nelson was alone in the water for the next 24 hours. Sunburned and delirious, he began shouting into the heavens, "I want to see my 21st birthday." Nelson had already turned 22, but he had been born on February 29th during a leap year, and had long held on to the personal goal of living to see 21 leap years. For a while, he didn't think it would happen. Early morning on the next day, October 27th, the Japanese fleet reached the area where he was adrift. The crew from the destroyer Yugumo found him and pulled him from the Pacific. Nelson remembered the moment.
I kept myself afloat, and pretty soon the dawn came and the sun came up, and it was a beautiful sunrise. sort of like the Japanese flag was all those rays. So now I was delirious. I was looking around and I thought I saw something on the horizon. It looked like a bunch of sticks. I thought I was hallucinating, so I didn't look at them any longer. I looked back a little later, and by God, they were moving. It turned out to be the Jap battleship fleet. They had those big pagoda towers on them, the cruisers, destroyers, the whole thing. They were making a zigzag pattern, and I was right in the middle of one of their squares. So I thought, well, it's better than nothing. I would rather take a chance on them than be shark breakfast. So every time I rose up on a wave, I would kick my feet to make a lot of whitewater. They just passed me by, so I started cussing at them. The last cruiser was just going past me, and then a destroyer came right across his bow, almost collided with him, and came alongside me. He put on the brakes, and you might say he threw a Jacob's ladder over the side. I was so weak, I couldn't even pull myself up. I just hung on. They pulled me in with the ladder and got me up on the deck. They poured a bucket of fresh water over me to wash the salt off. My hands were just terrible. I looked terrible.
Although the Japanese sailors gave Nelson food, water, and medical treatment, they were primarily concerned with interrogating him, determining his rank, rating, and position, and most importantly, determining on which carrier he served. Initially, Nelson lied and told them that he belonged to USS Hornet, but in searching his belongings, his captors found a pharmacy receipt that bore the name of his true ship, USS Enterprise. Nevertheless, Nelson tried to confuse his interrogators as much as possible.
They took me into the wardroom and started questioning me. They had this teapot sitting there. Every time I answered a question, they would give me about a thimbleful of tea. Of course, I was so damn dehydrated that all I really wanted was water. After a few questions, I began to realize that what they really wanted to know was how well they had done at Pearl Harbor. Having been there and seen all the damage and everything, I thought, well, I'm going to sink every damn ship we ever had. So that's the type of report I was giving them. Total destruction of everything. I kept telling those lies. Then the interpreter started questioning me about a lot more civil type questions. So I asked him why it was that Japan started the war. He said, when you put up that ABCD encirclement ring, that cut off our oil supply and we had converted all our ships to oil burners. We only had about a 6-month supply of oil. So it was either fight or give up. The Army had so much success in China that we thought we had better do it. That was the reason he gave.
The Japanese took Nelson to Truk Atoll and then to the Japanese home islands, where he remained a prisoner of war until August 1945. In 1942, at the time of his disappearance, the U.S. Navy declared him missing in action. Believing him dead, residents in his hometown named a road Nelson Avenue in his honor. In 2004, Nelson managed to reach his 21st leap year when he turned 84. He died on May 18, 2011, at age 91. Nelson considered himself lucky. 5 aviators from Enterprise's morning strike never returned, making the ultimate sacrifice. This was part of the heavy price paid by the U.S. fleet at Santa Cruz, the price paid for rushing into battle in order to be the first fleet to deliver the killing blow. By 6:15 a.m. on October 26, 1942, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was underway. Although the American fleet did not yet know it, a massive Japanese airstrike was heading right for it. At 7:10, shortly after an enemy scout plane had reported contact with American ships, the Japanese carrier force, called Kido Butai, launched 194 aircraft and sent them on a mission to annihilate the American carriers. 200 miles away and 20 minutes later, the American fleet, called Task Force 61, having finally received its own accurate scouting report, scrambled its own mission. One of the American carriers was USS Hornet, a 25,000-ton Yorktown-class carrier commissioned back in October 1941. At 7:32 a.m., Hornet began launching its airstrike. Its first wave consisted of 29 aircraft. 15 SBD dive bombers, 8 Grumman F-4F fighter planes, and 6 Grumman TBF torpedo bombers. Ensign Clayton Fisher was part of that mission. 23 years old, Fisher flew one of the SBDs, the 2-seat dive bombers. He'd been up all night, back when the first reported sightings of Japanese ships reached his squadron's ready room. The previous evening, he had expected the admirals to order an immediate launch, especially since the sky was clear and the moon was bright, but no orders came. Although Fisher did not yet know the reason, Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid had decided to hold back all launches until his scout planes confirmed the presence of the enemy carriers. Fisher remembered the agonizing waiting and the tension he felt when the go signal finally arrived.
All the pilots expected Hornets aircraft would be launched at dawn, but nothing happened. The task force commander was waiting for more accurate Japanese position reports. All I could think about was an early enemy surprise attack and having bombs come crashing down on our planes on the flight deck. Finally, we were given the command, "Pilots, man your planes." We rushed onto the flight deck and over the bullhorn boomed the command, "Start all engines." While taxiing forward to the takeoff spot, flight deck crew members held up chalkboards with a great morale builder message, which relayed that there was one more enemy aircraft carrier than previously reported. We had been briefed before we left the ready room that we would have only 4 F-4F Wildcat fighters from our fighter squadron to escort the dive bombers. Were we on a suicide mission? I was too busy checking out my engine and getting my plane ready for takeoff to think too much about what would lie ahead.
Lieutenant Commander Gus Widhelm commanded Hornets' airstrike. Guided by the scouting report sent to him only 10 minutes before takeoff, Widhelm led his planes straight to the Japanese fleet. At 9 a.m., after only 90 minutes in the air, the American planes found 4 Japanese ships. Specifically, they encountered 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers, which comprised part of the Imperial Navy's Vanguard force. However, these surface ships were not the primary targets. Rear Admiral Kincaid wanted his pilots to strike the Japanese carriers. Using hand signals, Widhelm ordered his aviators to keep going. They must keep flying and pass over these surface ships, even if it meant stretching their fuel supply to the limit. The gamble paid off. 15 minutes later, off his starboard bow, Widhelm caught sight of the Japanese carrier task force. In the center of it was a 32,000-ton aircraft carrier, the Shikaku. Widhelm broke radio silence, saying, "Contact bearing about 345. I have 1 carrier in sight. I am going after it." Widhelm signaled to his dive bomber pilots and to the 4-plane division of fighters that provided his close escort. They would attempt to take out the carrier. The remaining planes would test their luck against a nearby cruiser. Just after USS Hornet's dive bomber pilots changed direction, they encountered the Japanese fighter screen. 23 A6M Type 0 fighters charged in at the American planes, and a whirling dogfight occurred at around 12,000 feet. The 4 U.S. fighter planes were no match for their adversaries, and in a few minutes, one of them was shot down, and the other 3 were badly mauled by machine gun fire. After dispatching the American fighters, 13 of the Japanese fighter pilots pounced on the American dive bombers, who now had to rely on their rear seat gunners for protection. In the first few passes, Gus Widhelm's plane was hit, and it began streaming oil. Shouting obscenities into the radio, blaming the American fighter pilots for their shoddy assistance, he pulled his plane out of formation and ditched in the ocean. The Japanese fighter pilots did not let up. After Widhelm's plane went down, Ensign Kenneth White was wounded and part of his plane was damaged. He too dropped out of formation. Then Ensign Philip Grant's plane was hit. It went down streaming smoke. Both he and his gunner, radioman Floyd Kilmer, perished in the crash. Next, Japanese fighters targeted Ensign Fisher's plane. A burst of gunfire severed his plane's hydraulic line, sending fluids streaming down into the bilges beneath his feet. This battle damage prevented Fisher from scoring a hit on Shikaku. He remembered what happened next.
As our formation was approaching the position to commence our dives, I checked my hydraulically operated dive brakes. The brakes wouldn't open. As the planes ahead of me opened their dive brakes and began rolling into their dives, all I could do was follow the last plane down. But I had to move away from their dive paths so I wouldn't overrun them. With their dive brakes extended, the dive bombers would reach a maximum dive speed of about 240 knots. My plane accelerated rapidly to over 300 knots. Because of my excessive speed, I started pulling out above 2,000 feet and continued down until I had leveled out low over the water. My dive path had taken me well ahead of the Shikaku.
Although Fisher missed his target, his shipmates did not. 10 SPDs dived on Shikaku and released their bombs. In a few minutes, Shikaku was pummeled with 8 direct hits. The damage was extensive. The flight deck was cratered and 60 Japanese sailors were killed. However, the destruction was not irreparable. When they detected the American dive bombers, Shikaku's crew shut off the fuel lines and sealed the carrier's ordnance. As a result, no secondary explosions occurred and Shikaku did not turn into a burning pyre as had happened to 4 Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway. Still, the damage kept Shikaku out of action for the next 20 months. It did not return to combat until June 1944. For Hornet's dive bomber pilots, escaping the cloud of Japanese fighters that encircled them proved to be a dramatic endeavor. Ensign Fisher remembered what happened to him.
When I finally leveled off at 300 feet, my gunner yelled, "We got a 0 on our tail." Putting it mildly, it was a horrifying feeling. I couldn't outmaneuver a 0. My gunner, Radioman George Ferguson, practically shot off our rudder trying to hit it. Both wings were riddled with small jagged holes after being hit with 7.7mm bullets. One bullet passed between my legs, shattering my engine's temperature gauge. Finally, the 0 fired his 20mm cannons, and a shell exploded in the radio transmitter located behind my armored seat. A radio frequency manual was blown to bits, with confetti flying all over the cockpit. The concussion from the exploding shell felt like I had been hit by a hard blow on the top of my head. Simultaneously, I felt a red-hot burning sensation in my right arm just below the shoulder. Shrapnel fragments flying around in the cockpit had hit my upper right arm just above the elbow. Momentarily stunned, I had lost my vision, but my mind was visualizing the shimmering, wavering faces of my mother and my wife Annie. I didn't want to die, but I felt completely helpless.
Fisher's SBD was badly damaged. His flaps jammed and his plane began leaking fuel. His gunner had been wounded, and the 2 rear-facing .30 caliber machine guns had also jammed. Fisher described what happened next.
After recovering from the shock of the concussion, as my vision cleared, the 0 fighter with its big red meatball insignia was flying off my right wing just like a wingman. The pilot was staring at me. When our eyes met, he drifted back behind us. Ferguson had been shot in both thighs with 7.7mm bullets, and a piece of shrapnel had gouged some flesh out of the calf of his right leg. In spite of his wounds, Ferguson managed to reload the jammed guns and waited for the 0 to get into firing range. The 0's pilot evidently felt we were cold turkey and moved slowly into position for the kill. Ferguson fired first and hit the engine of the 0. With its engine smoking, the 0 pulled sharply away from us and then disappeared. We had miraculously survived. Ferguson had not panicked. He had saved both our lives.
It took another 90 minutes for Fisher to get back to safety. When he found USS Hornet, he discovered that it had been badly damaged by a Japanese attack. He rerouted to the other U.S. carrier, USS Enterprise, but by the time he arrived, Fisher discovered that his plane was too badly damaged to land on the deck. At 11:12, he ditched his dive bomber in the water near an Atlanta-class cruiser, USS Juneau. The crash knocked him unconscious, but his gunner, George Ferguson, pulled him from the sinking plane and into a life raft. In 4 minutes, the crew of Juneau had both aviators safely aboard and sent them down to sickbay. Clayton Fisher retired from the Navy after 21 years of service. He died in 2012, 2 weeks short of his 93rd birthday. He considered himself one of the lucky ones. Of the other 28 aircraft that had accompanied Lieutenant Commander Widhelm's group, only 17 of them made it back to their ships. 4 planes had been shot down, killing all 7 men on board. 4 other planes ditched due to battle damage, and one of those pilots was never seen again. The effort to cripple the Shokaku had come at great cost, claiming the lives of some of the finest aviators the U.S. Navy had ever known. At 7:10 a.m., the Japanese carrier strike force, Kido Butai, began launching its airstrike. Before U.S. Navy scout planes cut short this launch with a surprise attack, 2 of the Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, managed to get 194 attack planes into the air. Using an accurate sighting report from a scout plane transmitted an hour earlier, 53 of these planes charted their way southeast. At 8:53, they discovered Task Force 17, which included the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and its 10 escort ships. The Japanese attacked in 2 groups. At 9:10, coming in from a high altitude, Lieutenant Toshio Tsuda led the Japanese dive bombers. Then, a few minutes later, at low altitude, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Murata charged in with his torpedo bombers. Coming in from astern of Hornet, the Japanese dive bombers made a slanting dive from 5,000 feet. At first, many of the American gunners did nothing, not even certain that they were being attacked. But when the first bomb fell, they sent up a belated cloud of AA fire. The first bomb, the one dropped by Lieutenant Tsuda, missed to starboard, sending up a huge geyser of water. However, the second plane to attack did not miss. Petty Officer 2nd Class Katsui Miyakashi's bomb struck the center of the flight deck near the island structure. Coxswain Richard Nowatzki was a 19-year-old sailor aboard USS Hornet. When Miyakashi's diving attack occurred, he was at his battle station inside one of the starboard gun tubs. He recalled,
"I looked toward my right and saw a Japanese dive bomber heading straight for our gun tub. His wing guns were winking brightly as he fired at us. I shouted at the gun captain and our guns spun around to fire back at him. I locked the sights into automatic and looked again at the plane. I could hear the machine gun bullets strafing the flight deck and our gun tub as he dove at us. It was my moment of truth. My first gut reaction was to seek cover, but my training had kicked in and I automatically performed my job. I realized at that moment that my life could end in the next fleeting second. It was a terrifying thought as I watched the plane's tracer bullets converging straight at us. I saw his bomb release. It headed for our wildly careening ship and struck our flight deck. It hit near my station, but slightly forward of our guns. We heard the bomb hit and the plinking sound as it continued through several decks before exploding with a tremendous force. We lost all power to our gun mount as soon as the bomb exploded."
After the first bomb struck, the gunners noticed a new threat, the Japanese torpedo bombers. They were coming from both sides of the carrier low on the horizon. It was a perfectly coordinated attack. Hornet's anti-aircraft gunners were forced to divide their fire in 3 directions, left, right, and up. With electrical power cut, Nowatzki's gun crew had to crank their AA cannon by hand to deal with the new danger. Nowatzki remembered the experience.
"We put up a wall of shrapnel, but the planes kept coming. We fired as rapidly as we could, but we could not stop them all. Other ships were firing at them also, but there were just too many planes. The torpedo planes began making a very erratic approach, jerking themselves up and down to spoil our aim. When they were within range, they straightened out into level flight, just long enough to release their torpedoes. They flew right through our defensive fire and zoomed over us."
At that moment, another Japanese dive bomber scored a hit along the carrier's starboard edge. Shrapnel wounded Nowatzki.
A bomb exploded near us and I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my right thigh muscle. I shifted my weight to my left leg. I had heard stories of men in battle who lost an arm or a leg and only felt a small pain at first. I was afraid to look down as I cautiously felt for my right leg with my hand. It was still there, but so was something else. I felt a sharp pain in my right hand. I looked down and discovered a burning wooden splinter from our wooden flight deck that stuck in my thigh. It was about 12 inches long and was still smoldering. I jerked it out, relieved that I still had both legs.
By the time the attack ended, the Japanese airstrike had crippled USS Hornet. The carrier had been hit by 4 bombs. 2 torpedoes struck the starboard side, flooding the forward engine room. The power went out, the ship took on water, and it listed 11 degrees. Then, at 9:14, a damaged Japanese dive bomber, piloted by Warrant Officer Shigeyuki Sato, made a purposeful crash dive into the island structure. Sato's plane exploded, creasing the stack. His plane's wreckage smashed through the flight deck and spread fire into one of the squadron ready rooms. Fortunately, Sato's bomb, a dud, did not explode. It crashed into a ready room where it rolled to a stop between a stunned pilot's feet. Then, 3 minutes later, another Japanese dive bomber began bleeding smoke. This pilot had already released his bomb, but now he decided to execute a crash dive of his own. Banking sharply, he swung his plane 180 degrees and plowed it through the ship's hull. It blew up spectacularly, starting a fire in the forward elevator pit. By 9:25, the attack against Hornet was over, and the surviving Japanese planes were on their way back to their carriers. With fires raging, no power, and its terrible list, Hornet was dead in the water. Hundreds of men were killed, burned, or maimed. Destroyers came alongside, and with fire hoses and foam, they tried to assist the burning carrier. In a half hour, damage control parties had quelled the flames, but Hornet could not move under its own power. It took more than 2 hours for the crew of USS Northampton to attach tow lines to Hornet, but by 12:45, the carrier could be pulled out of harm's way. Coxswain Nowatzki had survived the attack with only a minor wound to his leg. During the damage control operation, he received orders to launch the whaleboat to evacuate other wounded men. Below decks, he saw the aftermath of the bomb explosions.
I could smell the sickening stench of human bodies burning, a smell that I can still recall. Wherever I looked, I saw a slaughterhouse. Evidently, at least one bomb had exploded in the hangar deck area. Dead and mutilated bodies were lying all about, even in the boat pocket. As I got in position, I saw the body of a young sailor laying right where I had to stand. I did not want to shove him aside, so I spread my legs to straddle him as I threw the lever to the crane. I glanced down at the sailor and noticed that his left cheek was twitching. I thought to myself, this guy may still be alive. I reached down and caught him by the shoulders to set him up. Then, to my absolute horror, I saw that he was gone from the waist down. He had been blown in half. I could only see a thin strip of flesh hanging from his waist. I lowered him to the deck as gently as I could and turned away from him. I leaned against the bulkhead for a few seconds to compose myself before I could again go back up the ladder. Walking through that scene was a mind-boggling, traumatic experience. Suddenly, a young sailor came up to me. In a bright, cheerful voice, he asked me, "Did you see all those dead sailors laying on the deck?" I looked at him, and I could see that he had gone around the bend. He showed me his arm. He said it had been broken, but he had fixed it himself. The arm looked normal to me. I tried to get away from him gently. He was insisting that I go with him to look at more bodies. He was completely fascinated by the slaughtered people lying about him. I told him I had to return to my gun, but I would look for him later. The last I saw of him, he was walking rapidly down the deck, talking loudly to himself.
The Japanese did not let up. At 1:45 p.m., another Japanese airstrike arrived. 8 fighters and 7 torpedo planes from the carrier Junyo, and one of them put another torpedo into Hornet's starboard side. 2 hours later, 2 more enemy dive bombers and 6 horizontal bombers tried their luck, putting 1 more bomb into the aft flight deck. Then, an hour after that, 10 more Japanese planes showed up, dropping yet another bomb into the exposed hangar deck. All the while, the crew of USS Hornet slowly abandoned ship, going over the side on monkey lines. Coxswain Nowatzki was almost the last to leave the ship. As he paddled in the water, he observed the second Japanese attack. He and a shipmate were nearly killed by one of the Japanese bombs that narrowly missed Hornet.
We heard the bombs explode. A few seconds later, to our complete unexpected surprise, a tremendous shockwave traveling through the water reached us. The water crushed my sides and testicles in an agonizing iron grip, while simultaneously brutally forcing its way into my lower intestines. At the same time, my spine felt as if I had been struck on the tailbone by a large hammer, and it really jarred me. Morlock and I involuntarily cried out in agony. It only lasted for a moment, but the unexpected pain was excruciating. If we had been much closer to the ship, the shockwave could have easily killed us. We were both groaning and gasping for breath and surprised to have weathered this latest unexpected onslaught. After a quick, desperate discussion, we decided to try for a raft to get out of the water.
At 5:40 p.m., USS Hornet's task force commander, Rear Admiral George Murray, ordered his destroyers to scuttle the carrier. Beginning at 6:30, 2 of them fired a spread of 16 torpedoes at Hornet, but it did not sink. Next, the destroyers fired over 400 rounds of 5-inch shell, which started fires, but still, the flat top did not go under. With the Japanese fleet approaching rapidly, at 8:30 p.m., the destroyers beat a hasty retreat. A half hour later, Japanese ships arrived on the scene and 2 destroyers, the Akigumo and Makigumo, began shelling Hornet and fired 4 more torpedoes into the ship. These weapons laid in the killing blow. Hornet finally disappeared beneath the waves shortly after midnight on October 27th. During the battle, Hornet lost 118 men killed or lost at sea, which accounted for 45% of all American losses at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The loss of the Hornet may very well have represented the greatest disaster on the American side of the engagement. By mid-morning on October 26, 1942, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was going badly for the U.S. fleet. The Americans had crippled 2 Japanese carriers, the Shokaku and Zuiho. However, one of their own carriers, USS Hornet, was dead in the water. For a harrowing 20 minutes, Hornet endured a murderous attack from a Japanese airstrike that killed 118 men. The Japanese had riddled Hornet with 4 bombs, 2 torpedoes, and 2 crash dives. On the other U.S. carrier, USS Enterprise, it became clear to the senior admiral, Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, that the situation was dire. He sent a terse communication to Vice Admiral William Halsey, which read, "Hornet hurt." Unwilling to give up on the Marines on Guadalcanal, Halsey replied that retreat was not an option. He said, "We must use everything we have to the limit." Despite the hyperbole, Halsey realized that the Battle of Santa Cruz had risked more than he was willing to lose. He needed to get USS Enterprise out of harm's way as soon as possible. If Enterprise sank, the U.S. fleet would be unable to rescue the Marines trapped on Guadalcanal. The fate of the South Pacific campaign swung in the balance. However, Enterprise could not evacuate just yet. With Hornet badly damaged, Enterprise had to assume the duty of recovering all returning strike aircraft. Not only did Enterprise have to recover 11 of its own planes, but it also had to accommodate more than 40 aircraft from USS Hornet, who now had no place to land. At 9:41, radar picked up Hornet's planes, which were coming inbound toward Enterprise in small groups. But then, a few minutes later, the radar also picked up 24 Japanese planes, 19 dive bombers, and 5 fighters from Shokaku, which were trying to find and sink America's last operational carrier in the Pacific. Everyone on Enterprise knew this was it, the fight to the death. On the bridge, Kincaid turned to a war correspondent, Eugene Burns, and said, "Burns, you're the most favored civilian alive. You're seeing the greatest carrier duel in history. Perhaps it will never happen again." All eyes turned toward the skies. The next few minutes rested on the capabilities of the 21 American fighter pilots who protected USS Enterprise's Task Force 16, the men of VF-10 and VF-72. The American fighter pilots started out this dogfight at a disadvantage. At Santa Cruz, the American fighter direction was shockingly poor. Although Enterprise's radar had picked up the incoming Japanese airstrike at 40 miles distant, the fighter director officer who sat inside the control room unwisely split the fighters into separate groups, sending one group in the wrong direction to intercept the orphan planes from USS Hornet. Initially, only 8 F-4F Wildcats were able to catch the enemy dive bombers en route to the target. Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vedaza was one of those. About 9 miles from the task force, he and his wingmen came into contact with the Japanese dive bombers. In later years, he remembered the moment well.
The enemy dive bombers were coming in. They were about 2,000 feet above us. My division had to climb and try to overtake them. We climbed and climbed, flying on instruments. And at 12,000 feet, I broke out of the fog, wing to wing with an enemy dive bomber. I was able to get behind them and blast 2 of them to bits before they pushed over in a steep dive. That was all it took, and they were gone. It was just bad maneuvering on their part. Then a pilot in my 2nd Division sighted a block of torpedo planes coming in. There must have been 8 or 10 of them.
Actually, there were 16 torpedo bombers, nicknamed Kates by the Americans, heading toward Enterprise. They were flying in 2 groups, 8 on the east side of the fog bank and another 8 on the west side. His wingman saw just one of those groups. Wasting little time, Vedaza attacked.
We practiced for months just how to manage a situation like this one. We had to control our dive speed, join their formation at close range and shoot them down. There was no room to maneuver. I was scared as hell at times, but we got right under them, what we had learned to do. By putting the pipper on the tail or wing stub, one short blast, we were using armor-piercing tracers and incendiary shells. The plane would burn right away. Their tanks were not protected, so they'd catch on fire, and once on fire, onto the next plane. I was 50 feet behind 4 of them in heavy fog. I got under their tails to avoid the rear seat gunners. First, I went after the single Kate on the left. I blew him apart, and he pitched forward. I expected the V to break, but it didn't. Then I went after the number 2 man. He pitched forward and blew up. I shifted to the leader, again careful to keep below him in order to stay out of the gunner's field of fire. When I hit him, he pitched up and back, and for a second I thought his wing was going to hit me, but it didn't. The last plane slowed down, and I flamed him as well. My reactions were automatic. The whole thing was over in 10 seconds.
In 2 encounters, Lieutenant Vedaza had shot down 6 aircraft, making him an ace in a single day, but he wasn't done yet. As he headed back to Enterprise, low on fuel and ammunition, he encountered the other group of 8 torpedo bombers. One of them emerged suddenly from a cloud and nearly collided with him.
His wing was practically in my prop. I could see the pilot and his 2 crewmen. I followed him toward Enterprise and turned in behind him, again under the tail. I fired a burst and it set him on fire. I had my pipper on his wing root where the fuel tank sits, but he didn't blow up and continued heading for Enterprise. I considered cutting off his tail with my prop if he got in position to drop his torpedo, but he never did. Finally, he caught a wingtip in the water and cartwheeled. That's when another Kate flew over the top of me real close. Why hadn't I been looking? I almost had a heart failure. All he had to do was drop down and fire his forward machine guns, and I was a goner. Instead, I'm on his tail and he's climbing. Then I saw the battleship South Dakota was going to open fire. I said to myself, I'll see if I have anything left to get this guy. I switched on all my guns and I had a few rounds left. Using them, I set him on fire. I was sure he was going to dive into the South Dakota, but she and the anti-aircraft cruiser San Juan began firing, putting up a withering fire. You could practically walk on the smoke from the AA. I tore some more pieces off the Kate and he caught fire but didn't explode. He never faltered. He didn't go down. He was losing altitude, but the pilot had to be alive at the controls because he corrected his dive very noticeably. At this point, with my ammo gone, I meant to cut off his tail with my prop. As I closed, I flew into the fire stream. My whole plane was full of smoke. Jesus, you talk about a blast. A plane like that with a whole stream of fire blowing back? I was within 50 feet and I got knocked to the right. I figured, Swede, that was a foolish move.
The last Japanese torpedo bomber never released his weapon. From his flaming cockpit, Seaman First Class Kiyomi Takei made a crash dive into the forecastle of a Mahan-class destroyer, USS Smith, killing 57 men. Swede Vedaza received partial credit for this kill, as well as 7 confirmed kills for the other planes he shot down. Unfortunately, Task Force 16, Enterprise's half of Task Force 61, did not escape the 3 Japanese airstrikes unscathed. In addition to the damage suffered by USS Smith, Enterprise endured 2 bomb strikes, killing 44 men. Despite the damage, the U.S. Navy fighter pilots had made the Japanese pay for their attacks against Enterprise. Altogether, the aircraft carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Junyo had sent 74 aircraft against Task Force 16. American fighter pilots and AA gunners brought down 28 of them, or 38% of the whole. Swede Vedazal landed on Enterprise at about 11 a.m. At the time, he didn't realize what an incredible achievement he and his fellow fighter pilots had accomplished. They had defended the last carrier in the Pacific from an air assault that, by all rights, should have sunk it. As he went in search of water, surveying the damage, Vedazal remembered stepping through the hangar deck, which was covered in water, oil, bodies, and blood. At one point, a wounded shipmate grabbed his arm, hoping to talk, but Vedazal had to shrug him off. He recalled, "I had to get back up in the air." It was that kind of dedication that saved Enterprise from certain doom. On October 27, 1942, 2 battered fleets sailed away from the Santa Cruz Islands. The U.S. Navy had suffered the loss of 262 men killed in action or lost at sea. One carrier, USS Hornet, had gone to the bottom of the South Pacific, along with 118 of its crew. Additionally, an unlucky destroyer, USS Porter, had been sunk by a freak torpedo accident, claiming 15 lives. USS Enterprise had lost 44 men, USS Smith lost 57, the carrier air groups lost 22, and 6 others died on USS Pensacola, USS South Dakota, and USS Morris. From his base at Noumea, Admiral Halsey ordered USS Enterprise and its escorts to return to the harbor, where repair ships waited to patch up the carrier's battle damage. Working at a feverish pace, the repair crews got the job completed in a mere 11 days. On November 11th, Enterprise sailed out of Noumea, and 2 days later, the fleet engaged in a climactic 3-day battle that ended the Japanese threat to Guadalcanal. After Santa Cruz, the Imperial Japanese Navy had considered pursuing the retreating American ships, but once their admirals took stock of the situation, they deemed that decision unwise. Although the Japanese fleet had not lost a single ship, they had lost twice as many men. 2 of their carriers, Shokaku and Zuiho, were so badly damaged that they could not continue flight operations. Another carrier, the Zuikaku, although undamaged, could not stay in the area either. It had lost so many planes and aircrew that it too could not conduct combat operations. The commander of the Japanese carrier task force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, withdrew his battered carriers to Truk Atoll, and eventually to the home islands for repairs. Only Rear Admiral Nobutake Kondo's surface fleet remained to protect the Solomon Islands. It contained only 1 carrier, the Junyo, and a greatly reduced air group. Kondo's fleet soon found itself far outmatched by the American counteroffensive. Nagumo had trouble coming to grips with the outcome of the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. He was loath to call it a defeat for Japan, but as a victory, the results were disappointing. Shortly after the battle, just as he was relieved of command and reassigned to shore duty, Nagumo wrote, "This battle was a tactical win, but a shattering strategic loss for Japan. Considering the great superiority of our enemy's industrial capacity, we must win every battle overwhelmingly in order to win this war. This last one, although a victory, unfortunately, was not an overwhelming victory." Ever since October 1942, military historians have been unsure how to explain the significance of the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Some have said that the battle could only be viewed as a tactical American defeat. After all, the U.S. Navy had lost an aircraft carrier and ended up retreating at the end of it. By contrast, the Japanese kept all of their ships and held the field. Other historians have said that the battle must be considered a draw, since it resulted in no forward movement by either side, keeping the status quo in the Solomons. However, these opinions did not reflect how Americans viewed the battle at the time. Despite the loss of Hornet, the U.S. fleet emerged from the battle as the powerhouse fleet in the South Pacific, and the Americans knew it. Admiral Halsey had promised to come to the assistance of the Marines on Guadalcanal, and the Battle of Santa Cruz had not changed that promise. The battle forced Japan to sideline its carrier fleet just in time for the pivotal naval battle in mid-November, which, in essence, set Japan on the path to defeat. The American survivors of Santa Cruz were optimistic of success. An officer on USS Enterprise wrote, "We know we licked the Japanese. They suffered far heavier naval losses than we did, and we still hold Guadalcanal. Let's not even give the enemy the satisfaction of knowing even what relatively little damage they did to us." In October 1942, the American effort in the South Pacific teetered in the balance. After Santa Cruz, it teetered no more.